and get started if everyone's ready. We'll call to order this meeting of the Planning Commission. May we have a roll call, please? No problem. I should have asked if you were ready because you're the most important people in the room in terms of making it happen. That's fine. Sorry. Here. 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 All right, we'll go to item number 2 on the agenda, the public meeting. Item 2A, public comment period for non-agenda items. Anyone wishing to speak on an item not on the agenda may be heard at this time. In the interest of time, please limit comments to 3 minutes or less. Is there anyone here to speak on an item not on the agenda? Seeing none, we'll turn to item 2B, public hearing, file number 311-24-000034-PLNG. Article 8, General Development Standards, revise off-street parking and loading standards to ultimately align the development code with state rule requirements. And we'll turn the time over to council, right? Or staff?
Staff, thank you.
Staff, sorry.
Yes, Matt Johnson, Senior Planner here at Forest Grove. Thank you, Chair Sanderson, Commissioners. As you mentioned, this is file number 311-24-000034-PLNG. Oh, sure, no problem. If we don't mind waiting for another moment for our slides, I appreciate your patience.
This is the work that usually gets done when we have the time before get it all set up, test it, and everything. So, our apologies, guys. It wasn't on purpose by any means.
It's okay. The funniest part was just how fast the room clears when you say Planning Commission.
It was quite impressive. Like, no!
No one wants to stay for that.
You guys see skid marks out that door right now.
Right, thank you. All right, so to continue, the purpose of bringing this item to you today is to provide a recommendation to City Council and consider these text amendments to the Forest Grove Development Code pertaining to climate-friendly and equitable communities which are rules that have been mandated by the state of Oregon. I will continue to reference them as the acronym CFEC for the rest of this presentation. So the state's goal for CFEC is to implement local standards to achieve science-based target reductions for greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2050. These CFEC rules affect both transportation and housing policy in the sense that it encourages more transportation options and creates additional opportunities for housing along transit corridors. Next slide, please. Some background of how we got here today. In March 2020, Governor Brown issued Executive Order 20-04, Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities. Those CFEC rules were adopted by the Land Conservation and Development Commission in summer of 22, which those rules applied to all urban and metropolitan areas throughout the state of Oregon. So after the state's adoptions of these rules, Forest Grove joined lawsuit with 13 other cities and counties challenging the rules, in which the lawsuit was largely rejected in May of this year. So the State Department of Land Conservation and Development granted Forest Grove an extension to implement these rules until the end of this year. So it's important to know that if the local rules are not implemented by that date per state law, the city will default to no parking mandates citywide. You may recall that the Planning Commission and the City Council held a joint work session in July this summer of this year to discuss timeline, the CFEC rules, and options to pursue for the city's implementation of these rules. Next slide. So the kind of key contents of these rules is major reformed parking requirements, increased multimodal access to streets, more dense development near transit lines, and provide for electric vehicle readiness in terms of infrastructure for EV charging. So some of the main provisions that are incorporated into the development code throughout your exhibits of the staff report. One, the city cannot require more than one parking space for each residential unit. Also, there are greater allowances for shared parking and off-site parking. Also, the city cannot require parking for daycares, different types of residential living facilities, and affordable housing, and some other land uses, transitional shelters, emergency shelters, what have you. The next slide, you can do that one, please. This slide shows you the half-mile corridor from within line 57, which in that blue buffer that you see, the city is prohibited from imposing parking standards for all development within there, so no parking minimums within a half mile of line 57. The next slide, please. The electrical vehicle charging, rideshare, and multimodal infrastructure. So things that fall under those provisions would be, I mentioned earlier, EV readiness. So all new multifamily projects are required to provide the conduit to at least 40% of the spaces in which they will provide. So they're not necessarily having to provide the charging kiosk itself, but the infrastructure laid so that they could be retroactively fit with the electrical charging station itself. There are a reduction to incentivize development with the reduction to the the minimum parking requirements when providing EV charging spaces. There's also for larger developments requirement for preferential placement of carpool and van pool parking, and then also redevelopment of existing parking for bicycle and transit uses. And then lastly, so in lieu of adopting regulations without parking mandates, the city chose during the work session to pursue option 2, which will require unbundled parking for serving leased commercial developments and multi-unit housing developments. And basically what unbundled parking is, you have your definition there, but in summary, it's And if you choose to pay for your parking, they must supply it separately from your rent or your lease. And you, as the renter or leasee, that you have the option to opt out and not have any parking associated with your lease or your rent agreement. And that wraps up staff's presentation. We recommend approval of the text amendments, and if you have any questions, we're here for you. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions of staff?
Can you talk more on the unbundled? What kind of impact are we expecting that to have, positive or negative?
Sure. I mean, I would believe that, typically, I think that would have more of an impact in a transit corridor that has more transit than the city of Forest Grove. One bus line. I can't imagine, at this point in time that new developments, new occupiers of new developments would opt out, since we're still very car centric. So personally, my belief is that I wouldn't see that change much. But I do believe it is a healthy option to have, and not to require somebody to, choose to pay for parking when they may not choose to drive.
Commissioner Farrell, if I can just kind of illuminate a little bit more, we have seen, I think, 3 new apartment complexes in Forest Grove, all of which have unbundled parking. So the Jesse Quinn building over here has unbundled parking. Forest Place has unbundled parking. And what's that one over, the newer one? The Resort at Fernhill, I believe, also has unbundled parking. To be very frank with you, the effect seems to be we get a lot of complaints about people parking on the streets because they don't pay for the parking and then they just go park on a residential street somewhere else. That's just the reality of this this sort of what we're doing here. If it isn't that, then we don't require parking at all, and then it's even more of a crapshoot, so to speak. Should point out that all of these new apartments that have all happened along the transit corridor, so we wouldn't be able to apply parking anyway. So the vast majority of development you're going to see is going to be without any required parking. They can still provide parking with certain maximums, but we're talking a lot about sort of the parking requirements and everything of things that probably aren't going to develop outside of this corridor anyway. So it's hard to say. With that said, the unbundling would still apply if they do provide parking. If that makes sense.
Well, I mean, as you stated, the city already made its best effort to get out of having to enact these amendments. I don't know. And I know that what we have here, I looked over the amendments, as the result of what the law is, and then some work sessions that we had in terms of choosing the best option. So my opinion, at least, is that we should probably approve these amendments. Does anyone disagree? So do we have a motion for approval of the proposed amendments listed in attached exhibits A through G?
Chair Sanderson, just FYI, purely sort of form here. This will be a recommendation to the City Council to approve these amendments.
Great. So do we have a motion to recommend to City Council approval of the proposed amendments listed in the attached exhibits A through G?
I recommend.
I'll second.
Can we have a vote?
Commissioner Berdahl? I vote that we recommend this proposal to City Council.
Commissioner Culbertson?
I vote that we recommend this proposal to City Council as well.
Commissioner Ellis?
Agreed.
Commissioner Falconer?
Yes.
Commissioner Farrell?
Agreed.
Commissioner Stenberg?
Agreed.
And Chair Sanderson?
Right, it's unanimous, and that's our recommendation. Thank you so much. Turning to item 2C work session on Forest Grove severe rent burden update. From one exciting topic to another.
We have another PowerPoint presentation, so we'll get that loaded here. Just a second. Thank you. So for the record, Dan Reardon, Senior Planner with the Community Development Department. Good evening, Planning Commission. The reason I'm here before you this evening is that because of state law, another state mandate, cities that are deemed to have a severe rent burden are required to provide an annual presentation during an open public meeting to talk about the causes and consequences of severe rent burden. This goes back to House Bill 4006 that was adopted by the legislature in 2017. The state law requires that 3 issues be discussed. 1, the causes and consequences of severe rent burden, and I'll talk about what that means in just a second. Barriers to reducing severe rent burden, and possible solutions for resolving severe rent burden. Slide, please. So by definition, under the state law, a community with severe rent burden is one where more than 25% of renter households pay more than 50% of income on housing-related costs, and that can include rent as well as utility costs. So it's basically housing costs generally. So the situation is that based on information provided by the U.S. Census American Community Survey, 33.3% of renter households in Forest Grove were experiencing severe rent burden in 2022. So this is a 2022 number. And I'll explain how the situation has changed a little bit since 2022. The American Community Survey is done by the U.S. Census Bureau. It's based on a sample. The Census Bureau publishes either 1-year or 5-year estimates. Because it's based on a sample, only about 2% of households are sampled annually. And for Oregon, the survey response rate was about 92% in Oregon for 2021, which is the 5-year estimate. The next slide shows how the situation has changed in terms of severe rent burden in Forest Grove since the law was adopted in 2017 and up through 2024. So just providing a snapshot over the last couple of years, in 2022, about 33.3% of renter households were deemed to be severe rent burden. It dipped a little bit in 2023, fell slightly below, just very slightly below 30%. The number of households dropped from about 1,074 to 980. And this variation can largely be attributable to the sample. So things are going to fluctuate, it's going to change. But the trend has stayed pretty constant. In 2024, things have increased slightly. So it went up from 29.9% in 2023 to 35.1% in 2024. So the actual number of households within Forest Grove that are deemed to be severe rent burden increased from 980 to 1,167. So things are not going in the right direction, but they have been it has been fairly constant. Next slide, please. So just to kind of show how Forest Grove relates to other similar communities in the region, Newburgh provides a good example in that it's a community about the same population as Forest Grove, and Newburgh also has a small private university. But the severe rent burden in Newburgh was 25.7%, so it's also considered to be a severe rent burden community because it's above 25%. But it's about 10% lower in terms of the number of households severe rent burden compared to Forest Grove. Canby, another similarly sized community, was just under 30% in terms of severe rent burden household, and McMinnville was just over 26%. So all of those communities were considered to be severe rent burden communities.
Can I ask a quick question about that?
Yes.
Do you know why that is? Is it because our rent is higher or because their income is higher? You know, like it seems like there's a couple of different factors that could affect that.
Yeah, I think it's because the rents in Forest Grove have been increasing over the last several years. Forest Grove was always one of the more affordable communities within the Portland metro boundary. But as Forest Grove has been growing, there's been more interest in living in Forest Grove. The population has certainly been increasing. That's put upward pressures on rent. And so where the Forest Grove rent was significantly lower in some respects to Washington County and the Portland region as a whole, it's tended to move more towards the regional average. And so our rents are increasing, becoming more comparable to what people are paying in Hillsborough and elsewhere, in Beaverton, elsewhere in the region.
Is that because I don't feel like we're comparing apples to apples based on county and location.
Mm-hmm. Well, the county overall housing costs have always been much higher than Forest Grove. And one measure for housing affordability is based on the area median income. And the area median income for the county as a whole has been significantly higher than what it has been for the city of Forest Grove in particular. And because of that, because incomes have been lower, rents have traditionally been lower in Forest Grove. But there's been upward pressure as the community grows, and the market is trying to catch up by providing additional rental opportunities within the community. We've seen much more, as Brian alluded to, much more in the way of apartment construction over the last 5 years. Several hundred new apartment units have been added in Forest Grove. Traditionally, housing production in Forest Grove has been the standard single-family detached unit. That changed probably 5, maybe 10 years ago, where we've been starting to see much more in the way of apartment construction. So even though there's been that we've had more housing production, it hasn't moderated rent increases. Rent is still increasing as the population grows. Also, the state has allowed for a certain percentage increase in rent from year to year, and I think some property owners, landlords, are taking advantage of that and increasing rent up to the maximum that's allowed. So there are a number of factors that are contributing to the cost of housing in Forest Grove. It appeared that because Forest Grove does have Pacific University and we have the student population, that's contributed to higher rents in the community. But when Forest Grove is compared to Newburgh, where the rent burden is significantly lower, that may or may not be a factor in terms of influencing rents within the community. So it's just, I think there are a number of factors that are influencing the direction that rents are going. And
Can I ask a clarifying question on that point about, because Newburgh and McMinnville both have comparable fees in them. You're saying that that doesn't explain, because there are universities in both of those cities?
I think the university contributes because that's there's more demand for rental units because of the university, the presence of the university. And anecdotally, it's been discussed that it's cheaper for students to live off campus than to live on campus and pay the rent that the university charges. So that's also contributing to more demand and perhaps upward pressures on rent. But in housing, and there's been more apartment development and trying to meet more of that demand from not only the university, but just renters generally. So I don't know how much of a factor Pacific University is in the community. It probably contributes to some degree. I think part of it too is just Forest Grove being within in the Portland region, the metro boundary. Newburgh and McMinnville aren't, and so there might be some dynamics because of that also that come into play.
Yeah, I was thinking that housing prices are going to be far greater in Washington County. That's kind of what I was alluding to when I asked the question. We're comparing to Yamhill, and property taxes are cheaper, housing costs are cheaper. So it might make sense that rental costs would be cheaper, and in some cases, you might have a higher income. But it's interesting to me that we're comparing against towns that are not within our boundary.
Yeah, it's not a direct comparison, other than the fact that they're similar in population to Forest Grove.
Is there any statistic that you're aware of that, we would expect like building more apartments would help reduce the rent burden because there's more competition, right? But as more people then move from outside Forest Grove into Forest Grove to take advantage of those apartments, do renters typically spend more of their income on rent than, by bringing more renters into the community? Is that affecting this number, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I don't know precisely what how that might influence rents. Certainly, new construction is costly, so the newer apartment units are going to command a premium in terms of rent. And then what tends to happen is the older properties upgrade so that they can compete with the new product. And so because there's costs associated with upgrading the property, that then they can charge higher rents. And so I think that has maybe more of an influence on rent.
So my understanding is it was a variable amount every year that rents could increase. And now we've decided it's 10%. Will that affect this if rents can't go up at variable rates each year?
I think that could. If it can increase the rent 10%, then landlords will likely increase rents 10%. Whereas in the past, where there wasn't that clear direction, if you will, it was more variable property to property in terms of what landlords wanted to charge for rent. I think that may have.
Sorry that turned into such a
Oh, no, that's good. It's
but-
exactly what this is intended to do, is to have that discussion, and that's
I have a quick question. Is senior affordable housing, that data factor into the rent burden?
If it's a renter household, then it would be factored into the data, and it just depends on how much of senior affordable housing is captured in the sample that the Census Bureau does to report the data, to collect the data, and report it. And then it just depends on whether the senior tenants, if what the rent is and what their incomes are, and whether if they fall into the rent burden category or not. It just depends. And I'm guessing that the sample probably doesn't pick up a large percentage of those units, and so probably not thoroughly included in the. Other questions? Okay, next slide, please. So some other factors contributing to the high level of severe rent burden in the community include, but are certainly not limited to, land costs. Land is expensive and construction costs are high. That hasn't changed. And construction costs are outpacing inflation generally. And then housing production is another factor, limiting factor. The private sector builds the vast majority of homes, and if they're market rate rental units, they're priced at whatever the market will bear. And clearly housing production is not meeting demand. And so things are a little bit out of balance, and so because of that, that's going to contribute to, if demand exceeds supply, the cost will, of course, be higher. And then investment expectations. Real estate is considered to be an investment with the expectation that real estate values will continue to rise. And as real estate values rise, both land and for improvements, that's going to influence the price that's charged for housing. Next slide, please. Some consequences of severe rent burden include financial pressures. Individuals and families facing severe rent burden must reduce spending on other needs, such as food, medical care, or education. When we were first starting out to do these public meetings, initially right after the law was adopted, we had some broader community meetings where public came in and we had a dialogue. We heard a lot of this, households need to make trade-offs, and as rent increases, they have to cut in other areas. I don't think that's really a surprise. And then limited housing choice. Some families may be forced to less desirable housing options, and this could be living in units that are small for the family size, or living in units that are maybe not up to code or maybe substandard in some respects. And then unfortunately, some individuals and families may be displaced, and some might not find adequate shelter. We all know about the issues around this, especially with the homeless population. Some would-be renters might be living with friends or family where they would prefer to live in a unit, but they can't find one, and so they're living with friends or family, either as a temporary or longer-term situation. Next slide. So noted barriers to resolving severe rent burden include income. Clearly, household incomes are not keeping pace with the increasing cost of housing, and this is especially true for renter households. There's limited capacity to build and manage enough regulated affordable housing units. There's been a lot of money going into building regulated affordable housing units, but it takes time, and putting together financing for projects and actually building projects and opening up units for residents, there's a considerable lead time. Long lead times for securing needed funding and just building the projects. And then in terms of what the city can do, the city doesn't receive federal housing funds directly. We're not considered to be an entitlement community eligible for federal funding. We have to compete with other communities for funding through the county or other sources. And so we must compete with other cities and agencies for the limited resources that are available. And we're not a housing agency. We don't have housing staff. And so we try to, where we can, provide incentives. And the next slide will show some of the things that have been done. One solution, and this is largely due to state law, middle housing. We amended our code a couple of years ago to allow for the middle housing types, which include townhouses, duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, and cottage clusters. We're seeing a lot more development in terms of the middle housing, especially in standard subdivisions. We're starting to see more attached units, mostly duplexes. But in the past, maybe prior to 5 years ago, it was largely just single-family detached units in planned developments. Now we're starting to see a greater mixture of housing units, which is encouraging. We have a pre-application conference scheduled in a couple of weeks to talk with a developer that's interested in doing our first cottage cluster project in the community. So that's interesting. That's encouraging as well. And so things seem to be moving in the right direction in terms of interest in the development community for building middle housing types and actually seeing that product on the ground. We amended our code as part of the middle housing rules to largely regulate development intensity by average lot size, required building setbacks, and structure height limitations rather than hard and fast minimum and maximum densities to provide more flexibility. And that's stimulating more housing production. Mentioned remove maximum density restrictions in the low density residential zones, simply because allowing triplexes and quadplexes in the lower density development, it didn't make sense to have the low density maximums in the lowest density residential zones, just because the triplexes and quadplexes would have exceeded those maximums, and so we did away with those. And again, now we just largely regulate development by the minimum lot size required by housing type and how tall you can build a structure and how far it has to be from property lines. Dwellings are allowed across the board in commercial zones except for single family detached, but within the commercial corridor along Pacific Avenue. It's largely a commercial zoning district, but it does allow for residential, and that's where we've seen a lot of our apartment projects. The Reserve at Fern Hill is one example that Brian mentioned. So we are seeing some apartment development in the commercial zones. We adopted a density bonus within the town center and a community commercial zone, and there's a density incentive for regulated affordable housing units. You can increase the maximum density in the commercial zone by 20 units per acre if you provide regulated affordable housing. The accessory dwelling unit restrictions were reduced. This was a result of Senate Bill 1055, which was adopted several years ago. And so that did away with requirements for additional off-street parking for accessory dwelling units. And also did away with design requirements for accessory dwelling units, which was a requirement of the state law. And then the accessory dwelling unit permit fees were reduced. And so right now, the accessory dwelling unit system development charge is tied to a manufactured home, which is the lowest rate for a residential unit. The system development charges, which largely pays for utility impacts, can be pretty significant. For a standard single-family detached home, it's roughly $45,000, depending on the size of the home. For an accessory dwelling unit, it's about $15,000, so it's considerably low. Next slide. Other policies that have been adopted, there's a nonprofit corporation property tax exemption program where a 501c3 or 501c4 charitable organization, an entity providing affordable housing can get a property tax exemption. We have several of those, several entities taking advantage of this program in the community. The vertical housing development zone was adopted. This is not an affordable housing project or program per se. It was used for the Jesse Quinn development. It provided some incentives for housing at higher density in the downtown area. If affordable housing is provided, both the land and the improvement, the structure is exempt from property taxes. If it's a market rate project, it's just the structure that's exempt from property taxes. Land is still taxed. And then there was an SDC financing and deferral program established for affordable housing projects. And what this does is it allows for collecting the system development charges at the time a certificate of occupancy is issued rather than at the time that a building permit is applied for. And that's so that an affordable housing provider will be closer to actually getting revenue once the units are rented, and then they can pay that system development charge rather than having to pay for it many months up front. And so that delays the collection to help with cash flow. And then the plan development code was revised to require a variety of housing types in the residential high density zoning districts, and that's been pretty effective with stimulating a variety of housing types within the plan developments in the community. So I think that's it. Be happy to answer any other questions that the commission has, or if there's any other thoughts you have about causes, consequences related to severe rent burden and housing generally. Be happy to take those comments.
When are we taking the next sampling?
Excuse me?
When are we going to take the next sampling? You said it was.
It's every year. We get the severe rent burden number from the state, from the Oregon Housing Community Services Department. We usually get it first quarter of the calendar year. So in another few months, we'll get the next update.
Sorry, I'm going to keep going. Is there a
please.
maximum threshold? Like what happens if we just like keep going?
So no, there isn't. This is not related to the severe rent burden issue specifically, but under state law, we have to update. We do a housing needs analysis. It's done every so often, every 5 to 7 years. It's now called the housing capacity analysis, and the state has a timeline for when communities have to update their HCA, and we're scheduled to begin ours in the next couple of years. I think we're 2 years out still. So that will look at what we think our long-term demand is for housing, how many units we need. We're required to engage in discussion with housing producers and consumers, so both sides of the equation. That's something new that came out of the state law. And so we'll have a better idea of what our housing production needs are the next couple of years. The state of Oregon, the Housing and Community Services Department will also be issuing housing production targets by city after the first of the year. So once those numbers are issued by the state, the city will be obligated to put strategies in place to promote housing production. And we have to bring forward a housing production strategy that will be reviewed by the Planning Commission and adopted by the City Council. And it'll lay out specific programs in addition to what we already have in place to help us meet those housing production targets that will come from the state. And so there's going to be a lot more around this issue in the next 2 to 4 or 5 years.
And I'm sorry if this is obvious. Are all of those solutions that have already been?
Yeah, what's up on the screen are things that have already been implemented.
So is there like a list of backlog ideas? Some crazy, some not that you've also thought of?
There is, a few years ago, when the middle housing rules were adopted, the state also adopted, there was HB 2003, another state law that focused on housing production. And the state developed a long list of different programs and strategies that communities can choose to use to stimulate housing production in the community. So there is more than what's just up on the screen that we can take a look at and assess.
Would it be when you act the first of the year are like taking over, or do you foresee that you're going to stick with those options that you've already shown? Or
Other ideas as well, and several communities have already gone through the process of updating their housing needs analysis and developing their housing production strategy, and so we're starting to get good information from some of the other communities throughout the state, as well as the Portland region specifically, on what has been working well and what hasn't been working too well. But it gets back to, and this is mentioned often, that cities don't produce housing. We can provide opportunity through our land use regulations and financial incentives so that the private market or even the affordable housing providers can construct housing. And so we can do what we can to provide those opportunities, but since we don't produce the housing, we're kind of in a somewhat difficult situation because we're going to have to meet these housing production targets without having the responsibility of actually producing those housing units. It's going to be those housing units. It's going to be another entity that's going to have to produce it. So it'll be interesting to see how that all works out long term. And we don't know. None of the numbers have been released yet for individual communities in terms of what their production targets are, and so that'll be interesting to see what it is we'll need to try to meet. And we're just going to have to see what we can do to meet our obligations.
but when will we include looking at like rezoning areas? Is that what you're trying to?
So that's related related to this issue. One in particular is the city's urban reserve area. We have the urban growth boundary, and under state law, the urban growth boundary is intended to include enough land to meet 20-year demands for all types of development, so not just residential, but commercial and industrial. In the Portland region, it's looked at regionally, not city by city. So Forest Grove doesn't specifically control the urban growth boundary that's near Forest Grove. We have land use planning authority for the area inside the urban growth boundary adjacent to the city, but it's Metro that makes a decision on whether or not the boundary is expanded, and if it is expanded, where. So this is a little bit different than other communities elsewhere in the state. But we have an urban reserve area that's intended to provide land for beyond that 20-year period, so 20 to 50 years basically. But our urban reserve area is a very difficult to develop area. It's steeply sloped, it's further up on David Hill, and it's going to be costly to develop. It's going to be costly to get the infrastructure there. And so that's going to have an impact on housing prices in Forest Grove. We did the West Side Refinement Planning Study back in 2017 to look at development further up on David Hill Road, and it was clear that there would likely need to be supplemental fees to fund things like infrastructure and sanitary sewer line expansions. So that $45,000 number would likely go up in terms of the utility impact fees, the system development charge. And some communities have already adopted supplemental fees. City of Hillsborough for the South Hillsborough area south of TV Highway. There are supplemental system development charges that apply there. And so coupled with that new construction is expensive, you have higher utility impact fees. That's just going to, of course, increase the cost of housing and the cost of rent. So one strategy is to try to retain the organically occurring affordable housing in the community. It might not be regulated. It might be older housing stock. Preserving that housing stock and providing incentives so the property owners can maintain those properties. It's a way of retaining our more affordable housing stock in the community. So that's one strategy.
Sir, I have a quick question since you brought up Metro. Did the affordable housing bond help to move the dial at all? I know there were a handful of projects based on that pie being sliced.
Yeah, it did. The Valfrey project on 26th Avenue and Main Street, that was partially funded through the Metro Affordable Housing Bond, and that created 30 units in the community. One issue related to the Affordable Housing Bond is scale, and it's more cost effective to do larger projects. And in Forest Grove, we just don't have the land available for larger projects, and so they tend to be smaller, not as cost effective. And so in terms of projects, they tend not to compete as well with some of the larger scale projects elsewhere in Tigard and Beaverton and some of the Hillsborough communities. So that's one issue that I think is a reason why we haven't seen more bond projects in the community, just because the scale isn't, but it doesn't generate enough units to make it pencil.
Any other questions?
I was going to ask, has there been any new movement on the apartment project that we approved earlier this year?
No, Brown's Farm. Yeah, that was over 300 units, so large project. The developer came in a few months ago with their partition plat. That was one of the, they had to create discrete parcels for the different parts of the project, the commercial piece and the residential piece. We're trying to get that recorded with the county. We had a meeting with a group that was interested in doing the commercial development, and it seemed like that was going to happen first ahead of the residential development. But in terms of the apartments, nothing has changed since the land use approval was granted. I'm not exactly sure why, but still kind of on hold.
All right, well, thank you so much for answering all of our questions and the presentation.
Thank you. Thanks for the discussion.
Item 2D on the agenda, action items, none scheduled. How about, we'll turn to item 3, the business meeting. Approval of minutes from Monday, 9/3/2024. Did everyone have a chance to look at those minutes and remember how we didn't get out till 10 p.m.? Do I have a motion to approve the minutes?
I'd like to do a motion to accept the minutes from September 3rd, 2020.
Thank you.
I'll second that.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any nays? All right. Director's report.
Thank you, Chair Sanderson. Brian Pohl, Community Development Director. Just letting you know, checking in about your Planning Commission dates coming up. We are not aware of any that are in the pipeline right now. We do anticipate some filings soon, but there's nothing that we need to schedule a meeting for. So no news right now as far as your next meeting is concerned. We will definitely keep you abreast of any changes about that. Some of you may have noticed the city has been embarking on the Forest Grove Forward project. And we haven't talked about that with this group yet, but that's basically a visioning exercise for the whole city. And I think a lot of people have probably confused that with like the comprehensive plan and stuff like that. But this is really sort of think about it as a quality of life plan. You know, what are things you see in other cities that we don't have here? You know, what would you like to see worked on? It might not be city issues. It might be something for the university to do, or it might be something for Adelanto Harris to do, or something like that. That project is moving along very well. The survey just closed last week, and the consultant that we are using, which is Sarah Singer Wilson. They are in her company. They are starting with some focus groups soon, sort of targeted focus groups to get feedback and everything, and kind of see where the surveys sort of landed, feedback on those sorts of things, what was missed, those sorts of things, and so look for more about that. There will be additional opportunities for civic engagement on that. But for right now, that survey is closed. They got about 1,500, a little over 1,500 responses, which is pretty good. Wanted to see a lot higher, but it's better than we've done for a lot of other surveys. So that project will push forward probably until late next year, it seems like. So a lot going on there. With the Urban Renewal Agency, you may have heard about the Fresh Foods grocery store. That is a company out of Manzanita, Cannon Beach. They also have a place in Washington now on the Washington coast. This would be their first location in the metro area or anywhere east of the Coast Range. We are still working with them. We're under an exclusive negotiating agreement with them right now to move forward. This is the property over by Jesse Quinn, the empty lot that everybody's kind of parking on these days. The developer is really interested. He's very invested, and he's spent about $500,000 in plans and sort of work to get ready for this thing. But once interest rates spiked, kind of killed the project. And so right now, URA is working with the developer as well as third party Johnson Economics to kind of put together a package for how we make this thing pencil and everything. The ENA is good for 6 months. I don't recall when it was signed, but I think we're about 2 months into that right now. And so the goal here is to get it across the line for a DDA, which is the Disposition and Development Agreement, which basically lays out all the terms of sort of what the city or the URA's participation will be, what the expectation is for building, site work, and sort of that sort of stuff. And then we would get that thing to construction. Things are looking fairly optimistic right now. If you recall, this was actually under an ENA before, and then once those interest rates spiked, it kind of fell out of the ENA and nothing was going to happen with it. This third party is really kind of helping push the ball and keep everybody kind of moving in the same direction. He has brought back, the developer has gone back to his designer and did some value engineering and kind of brought down the cost of the property. He's also looked at putting groceries on 2 stories now rather than just one. The first time he thought it was just going to be, a story of groceries and a story of office above it or something like that. And now he's looking pushing towards 2 stories of groceries, which will sort of help his margins somehow in ways that I don't understand, but I don't need to. And so it is moving forward, and just so we get a lot of questions about that in this room sometimes. And so that's the status of the Fresh Foods. And that's all I have to report for right now. Thanks.
Brian, 2 questions on that. Do you know what size square footage they're thinking, and who's the developer?
The developer is Fresh Foods. I mean, he's developing his own. Yeah. I need to ask this size. I know it's right between 19,000 and 20,000 square feet. So not huge. I mean, very much a boutique kind of grocery store. I probably wouldn't say that if there were cameras on me right now, but it's a sort of higher end, very focused on local grocer or local products and things like that. They have a lot of contracts with different wineries and cheese makers and everything, and so it is something that I think our market is demanding for sure, and I think will be well received. But it will not be a huge grocery store. It won't be that kind of place that you go stock up on groceries. Well, I mean, don't want to assume, but not somewhere that I would go stock up on groceries. I would say if I have friends coming over, I might go grab some cheeses and wines, and that I would prepare with them. But it's a great thing, and hopefully it moves forward soon.
And we have a new planner.
My gosh, I am so sorry.
When did we get a new senior planner?
That was actually number 1 on my list, and I didn't cover it. So Matt Johnson is here. He is our new senior planner, our new Amy or Kate, depending on how long you go back on the Planning Commission. Matt joins us from Round Rock, Texas. He was living in Austin prior to this. Master's degree, AICP, very, very qualified planner. And you may have seen me walk over and give him a pat on the back after that CFAC presentation. I mean, the guy's been here a month, and he's put together some quality work. And so hope you all recognize how special that is and how lucky we are to have him.
Thanks. And we also have Angela. She was here at our last meeting as well, but we just didn't have time to be nice.
We had a long night already.
So welcome. And I think this is the first time we've had the full panel up here in quite a while. So it's nice to have everyone here.
I don't know that I necessarily want to talk about this right now, but we've got some code edits that are not CFEC on the horizon. One of those things was kind of like, we learned some things about our industrial zone in the proceedings recently, and there are definitely some code edits that are possible here. I don't want to get into too much detail just because it's still sensitive, but I think we're going to have a work session with council soon to talk about some of the things that they'd like to see changed in the development code. Staff has some things that we would like to see changed, just some sort of housekeeping for us more than anything. So if there is feedback you all have, we're happy to host a work session. We're happy to do another joint work session. We don't do those very often, but I thought that was really effective last time with CFEC. So we'll see how that goes. But if you have things that are driving you crazy in our development code, let us know. We're all ears. So I'm not sure when that's coming. It might be spring, might be early summer, but it is coming. I was trying to stay away from it, but go ahead, please.
Everyone knows. So the city council heard the appeal on the staff and planning commission decisions on the Crane Data Center and affirmed both and denied the second appeal. It was on a 4-0-1. One counselor abstained. Our notice of the city council decision went out last Thursday. There's a 21-day appeal period should anyone want to appeal the city council's decision to the Oregon Land Use Board of Appeals. No, Thursday before Thanksgiving, if any further appeal has been filed. So
And it should be noted here, is that when Dan's talking, maybe think of, if you start seeing excavators out there, I mean, they're not unable to move forward with construction in those 21-day appeal periods. So I don't think they're going to get there that fast, but that's not sort of that 21-day appeal period is not like an automatic stay or anything. They have to go to LUBA and ask for that stay in order for local permits not to be issued. So no telling when they're going to get started. I think they're still a little bit of ways away with engineering right now, but it's moving forward.
All right.
Any status on the other one up Sunset?
That one's totally dead.
Totally
Yeah,
dead?
yeah. That one was. They worked the power a lot differently. They wanted all the power at once. They weren't going to phase up the way the Crane was going to do. And my recollection, don't quote me on it. My recollection was they weren't going to be able to get the power they needed from BPA until 2037 or something like that. So it's a very interesting sort of learning thing about the grid, and we didn't talk about it much in the proceedings because it was, just we were trying to focus you guys on what the criteria were. The grid's interesting because it's not so much of a generation issue as it is sort of the upstream sort of blockages. They would have done some major improvements out in Hillsborough to get something here. If you're going up Corn Pass to 26, right there on the southeast corner of 26 and Corn Pass, there's a huge substation right there. And there's some improvements they would have had to make there. Also some improvements they would have had to make way further, like east of Portland as well. Where there's some choke point up there for getting that kind of power. It's going to keep being an issue. If I had to read the tea leaves, I would assume that we would talk about making data centers a conditional use or something like that, so that those livability issues could be examined in the process. But that's not something that anybody's said yet, and just sort of my editorializing that could happen. There's a lot of things we're discovering in that process.
So I mentioned the housing needs analysis in the severe rent burden presentation. There's another document that we produced called the economic needs analysis, economic opportunities analysis. And we're in the process of updating that document now. And that'll tell us what our long-term 20-year demand for industrial lands are. The reason I mention that is because the data center project off of Oak Street in that area is not moving forward. We've received a number of inquiries from groups asking about redesignating that property, changing it from industrial to something more residential or mixed use. And so we're just waiting for the, yeah. So we're waiting for the results of the economic opportunities analysis to provide some guidance on a direction, possible direction.
We've done that every 5 years, and so 2019 was the last time when we did, and it showed that we had far more industrial land than we needed, and we were a little bit short on retail, commercial, mixed-use sort of land. That appears to have kind of been flipped on its head at this point, you know, and it depends on which forecast you go with. There's a safe harbor state forecast. Metro would think that we're never going to build another industrial thing again, from what they kind of give as guidelines. Then there's sort of our reason sort of forecast about sort of where, given our current trends, where industrial growth is likely to happen and how much land is needed for that industrial growth. And so that will be a policy decision for you all and for the city council to kind of decide, which of these scenarios we're going to go with. And so I say all that because, at the time that we were looking at rezoning all that property, where Birch was originally going to go with the data center, we were looking at mixed use sort of Main Street concept and everything, that we really thought was a very viable sort of land use pattern out there. And there was some excitement behind it. When the data center people came along to Woodfold Manufacturing, who owned that big property up on Oak Street, they said, hey, can you pause this for a second? Let's see how this data center thing goes. And so Birch, the data center, I think what's their name now? It's not Birch now. Rowan Green, bought that property before they had any land use entitlements or anything. So now they own this property, and they've been kind of poking around with different consultants trying to float some concepts out there. The problem is now when this EOA is working forward, we're going to show that we are not by any means oversupplied in industrial land. In fact, we're very undersupplied in industrial. Metro-wide, there is a whole issue with large lot industrial. And we just happen to have one of the sites that is a very large lot industrial. And so it'll be interesting to see how this plays out because the paradigm has just changed. There's a lot of difficulty right now finding industrial properties. And so to the extent that we have large industrial properties and potential exists to develop them, I don't know which direction we'll go. And so that will be a very interesting conversation for all of you, I think.
Great. Thank you. We're adjourned.